A pregnant dog knocked on my door at midnight. She wasn't lost. She wasn't hungry. She was running out of time. I had no idea I was about to be tested in a way I never expected. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe. I had already locked my door for the night when the sound came again. Not loud, not sudden, just a slow, uncertain knock, like someone using the last bit of strength they had left. At my age, 72, you learn the difference between a knock that wants attention and a knock that is afraid of being ignored. I remember standing there in my small living room, the lamp humming softly beside my old chair, wondering who in their right mind would come to my house so late. The road near my place had been quiet for years. Most nights, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees or the distant hum of a truck far down the highway. That night, though, the silence felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. I didn't open the door right away. I never do. Living alone teaches you caution, especially when your body doesn't move as fast as your thoughts anymore. I stepped closer, leaned my ear toward the wood, and listened. No voice, no footsteps walking away, just breathing, slow, uneven, almost painful. For a moment, I thought maybe it was my imagination, the way old memories sometimes echo when the house gets too quiet. But then came the sound again. Not a knock this time. A soft scraping, like something touching the door by accident rather than intention. That's when I felt it. That strange pressure in the chest that tells you something outside is waiting on you, whether you want it to or not. When I finally opened the door, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. There was no person standing there, no neighbor, no stranger asking for help. Sitting right at my doorstep was a dog, a medium-sized stray, soaked from the damp air, her fur clinging to her body like she'd been out there far longer than she should have been. What struck me first wasn't her condition, though. It was her stillness. She didn't bark, she didn't growl, she didn't even flinch when the door creaked open. She just looked up at me, eyes dark and steady like she already knew who I was and why she had come. Only then did I notice her belly, heavy and low, unmistakably swollen. She was pregnant. Very pregnant. I stood there holding the door half open, the cool night air slipping inside, and for a long second neither of us moved. I've seen a lot of dogs in my lifetime. Hunting dogs, house dogs, strays passing through, but I had never seen one look at a man the way she looked at me. There was no fear in her eyes, no begging either, just expectation, like I was already part of whatever decision she'd made before coming to my house. I felt suddenly exposed, like I'd been chosen without being asked. And the strangest part was this: she hadn't knocked to be let in, she had knocked to be seen. I spoke without thinking, my voice rough from disuse. "What are you doing out here, girl?" The words sounded small in the night. She didn't respond, of course. But she shifted slightly, adjusting her weight, and I could see then how tired she was. Her sides moved with every breath, slow and labored. One of her back legs trembled as she tried to sit straighter, like she didn't want to look weak in front of me. That hit me harder than I expected. I had spent most of my life doing the same thing, standing when I should have sat, smiling when I should have asked for help. I thought about closing the door. That thought passed through my mind quicker than I care to admit, not because I didn't feel for her, but because opening that door meant responsibility. It meant change. It meant inviting something into my life that I couldn't just ignore the next morning. At my age, you start counting what little peace you have left. But as I stood there, watching the dog struggle just to remain upright, I realized something else too. She hadn't come here by accident. My house sat far from the main road. You didn't just wander onto my porch unless you were looking for something specific. I stepped back and opened the door wider. She didn't rush in. She didn't even try. She stayed right where she was, like crossing that threshold wasn't her goal. Instead, she slowly turned her head, looking past me toward the side yard, then back at my face again. Once, twice. It was subtle, but clear. She wanted me to follow her. And in that moment, standing between the safety of my quiet home and the unknown waiting outside, I understood something that sent a chill through me. Whatever she had come for, it wasn't about her anymore. It was about time, and time, I could tell, was running out. I didn't follow her right away. At my age, you learn that instinct can be both a gift and a danger, and mine was pulling me in two directions at once. I stepped back inside for a moment, grabbed the small flashlight I kept near the door, and filled an old metal bowl with water. When I came back out, the dog hadn't moved. She was still sitting exactly where I'd left her, rain-darkened fur pressed against the wooden step, eyes fixed on me as if she was counting every second I'd been gone. I set the bowl down gently in front of her, expecting her to drink like any hungry, exhausted animal would. She didn't even sniff it. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Any stray that comes to a man's door at night is usually desperate for food or warmth. She wanted neither. She glanced at the bowl, then looked back up at me, her ears lowering slightly, her body shifting with discomfort. I could see her sides tighten, then relax again. A slow wave passing through her belly, pain, real pain, not the kind that comes from hunger, but the kind that demands attention whether you're ready or not. I crouched down as best I could, my knees complaining, and that's when I noticed her breathing had changed. It was shallow now, uneven, like she was trying to hold something back. I reached out slowly, careful not to startle her. My hand hovered in the air between us for a moment, giving her time to decide if she trusted me. She didn't pull away. When my fingers finally touched her back, her fur was cold, damp, and trembling beneath my palm. She let out a low sound, not a whine, not a bark, just a quiet vibration from deep in her chest. I'd heard that sound before, years ago, from a dog that knew it couldn't make it much farther on its own. My stomach tightened. Whatever she was carrying inside her wasn't waiting for morning. I tried again with the water, nudging the bowl closer. This time she stood up, but not to drink. She turned, slowly, deliberately, and took a few unsteady steps away from the porch. Then she stopped and looked back at me. Her tail didn't wag. Her ears didn't perk. She simply waited. When I didn't move, she took another few steps, then stopped again, glancing back with a look that wasn't impatience, but insistence. She wanted me to come. Not later. Not after I rested. Now. I should have listened to my fear. The smart thing would have been to call someone right then. Animal control, a neighbor, anyone younger and faster than me. But there was something about the way she moved, the way she carefully placed each paw like the ground itself might give out beneath her. That told me time wasn't a luxury we had. I grabbed my jacket, pulled it tight around my chest, and stepped off the porch. The dog didn't run. She slowed her pace to match mine, glancing back every few steps as if making sure I was still there. We moved along the side of my house toward the back, where the trees grew thicker and the ground dipped slightly toward an old drainage path that hadn't been used in years. The flashlight beam shook as I walked, catching glimpses of wet leaves, broken branches, and the uneven earth. The dog kept stopping, her body tensing every time another wave of pain passed through her. Once she stumbled, and my heart jumped into my throat. I reached out without thinking, steadying her just enough to keep her upright. She leaned into me for a second, trusting me with more than I felt prepared to hold. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind pushing through the trees, a thin sound slipping between the branches. But then it came again, faint, sharp, and wrong. A sound too small to belong to the night itself. The dog froze, her head snapping toward the darkness ahead. Her breathing quickened, and she let out that low sound again, louder this time. Whatever lay beyond the trees, she had already been there, and she had come back for me because she couldn't face it alone. I stood there in the damp grass, flashlight cutting a narrow path through the dark, suddenly aware of how fragile my body felt in that moment. 72 years of life had taught me how to endure loss, loneliness, and silence. But not this. Not being led into the dark by a pregnant animal who seemed to understand urgency better than I ever had. I took another step forward. my shoes sinking slightly into the mud, and realized with a quiet dread settling in my chest that I wasn't just following her anymore. I was being trusted with something that could not be undone. The ground sloped downward as we moved farther from the house, and with every step I felt the distance growing, not just in space, but in certainty. The flashlight beam wavered over tall weeds and damp soil, catching the outlines of things long forgotten. I hadn't been back here in years. Most people avoided this part of the land because there was nothing useful left in it. No fence, no lights, just an old concrete opening half swallowed by mud and leaves, a remnant of a drainage system that once carried rainwater away from the road before the county rerouted everything and let this place rot. The dog slowed as we approached it, her body tightening like she recognized the ground beneath her paws. She stopped a few feet from the opening and refused to go any farther. I stepped up beside her and shone the light forward. The beam slid across cracked concrete, tangled roots, and the dark mouth of the drain itself, wide enough for a grown man to crawl into if he had no better options left in life. The air coming out of it felt colder than the night around us, damp and stale, like it hadn't moved in a long time. I was about to suggest we turn back. Yes, I know how foolish that sounds now, when the sound came again. Clearer this time, high-pitched, fragile. It echoed faintly off the concrete walls before disappearing into the trees. My breath caught halfway in. That wasn't the wind. The dog let out a soft, desperate whine and lowered herself to the ground, her belly brushing the wet earth. Another wave of pain moved through her, visible even in the dim light, her muscles tightening as she fought to stay still. And then I understood why she had stopped. She couldn't go any farther. Whatever she had left inside that drain, she had already given everything she had to get back to me. My chest tightened with a pressure that felt uncomfortably close to fear. I had been brought here not as help, but as the last option. I crouched down, my knees protesting loudly, and aimed the flashlight into the opening. At first I saw nothing, just darkness swallowing the beam. Then, slowly, my eyes adjusted, and I noticed something pale against the concrete floor inside. Small, too small to be a rock. I leaned in closer, heart pounding, and that's when it moved. Just slightly. A weak twitch. The sound came again, barely louder than a breath. A puppy. Alone. Cold. And still alive, but only just. I don't remember making the decision. One moment I was frozen, trying to understand how something so fragile ended up in a place like this. And the next, I was lowering myself to the ground, ignoring the sharp pain in my back as I reached into the drain. The concrete was icy against my arm, the smell thick and sour. I pulled the tiny body toward the light, my hands shaking so badly I was afraid I'd drop it. The puppy was slick, its eyes sealed shut, its chest rising in shallow, uneven bursts. I wrapped it in my jacket without thinking, pressing it gently against my own chest, hoping the warmth might be enough. Behind me, the dog struggled to stand. She staggered forward a step, then another, her legs trembling under her weight. When she reached us, she lowered her head and touched her nose to the bundle in my arms, breathing in sharply. Her entire body sagged with relief, like she'd been holding herself together by will alone until this moment. But that relief didn't last long. Another contraction hit her harder than the last. She let out a sound that made my stomach twist, and suddenly the truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't over. I shone the flashlight back into the drain, dread creeping up my spine. The beam caught movement again, deeper this time, further inside where the light barely reached. Another shape, and another sound, weaker than the first. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and felt something heavy settle in my chest. The dog hadn't brought me here to save what was already lost. She had brought me here because there was more coming, and she didn't have the strength to face it alone. I looked at her, kneeling in the mud beside me, her eyes fixed on my face with that same steady, unblinking trust she'd shown me at the door. Rain began to fall again, light but persistent, dotting the ground around us like a ticking clock. Somewhere inside that drain, life was hanging by a thread, and standing there in the dark, holding a newborn against my heart, I realized with a clarity that left no room for doubt. If I failed her now, there would be no second chance. I don't remember how long I stayed there kneeling in the mud. Rain soaking through my jacket, the newborn puppy pressed against my chest like a fragile secret I was terrified to lose. Time had narrowed down to a single truth. If I hesitated now, something would die. The dog's breathing grew faster, her body shuddering with each contraction, and I realized with a sharp clarity that I wasn't standing at the edge of a situation anymore. I was already inside it, alone, too old, and responsible. I fumbled for my phone with numb fingers and called the first emergency animal number I could find. The line rang longer than it should have. When someone finally answered, their voice sounded distant, like it belonged to another world. A world where rain didn't fall into open drains and dogs didn't give birth in the dark. I tried to explain, my words tripping over each other, but there are moments in life when language fails you. All I could manage was this: pregnant dog, puppies trapped, middle of nowhere. The voice on the other end told me help was coming, but not fast enough. Not for what was happening right in front of me. The dog cried out again, louder this time. Not a bark, not a growl. A sound pulled straight from pain. I turned back toward the drain, heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the rain. The flashlight beam shook as I leaned in, catching the small, slick shape moving weakly inside. I knew nothing about delivering puppies, nothing about what to do when life hesitates at the edge of the world. But the dog didn't need experience. She needed presence. And that, at least, I could give. I wrapped my jacket tighter around the puppy I'd already pulled free and placed him carefully on the ground beside me, shielding him from the rain with my body. Then I reached into the drain again. The concrete scraped against my arm, cold and unforgiving. My fingers brushed something warm, then slippery, and I felt a rush of fear that almost made me pull back. The puppy inside wasn't moving much. Its body felt limp, wrong in a way I didn't want to understand. I whispered without realizing it, words meant for no one and everyone at once, and gently drew the tiny body into the open air. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The puppy lay still in my hands, chest unmoving, mouth slightly open. The rain kept falling. The dog went silent behind me, and that silence felt heavier than any sound she'd made before. I rubbed the puppy gently with the edge of my shirt, the way I'd once seen someone do years ago, desperate and uneducated but unwilling to quit. My hands shook so badly I could barely keep hold of it. Then, just when I was about to accept what I thought was inevitable, the puppy gasped, a tiny, sharp intake of breath followed by another, weak but real. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and pressed the puppy close to my chest, warmth and movement returning slowly, painfully. Behind me, the dog collapsed onto her side, exhausted beyond anything I'd ever seen. Her sides heaved as she fought for breath, eyes half-lidded, body slick with rain and effort. She had nothing left. I could see it in the way her head rested against the mud, the way her tail didn't move at all. Fear crept in again, colder this time. Saving the puppies wouldn't matter if I lost her. I spoke to her then, softly, foolishly, the way lonely people speak when they don't want silence to win. I told her to stay with me, told her help was coming, told her she'd done enough. I don't know if she understood the words, but she lifted her head slightly and looked at me, eyes clouded with pain but still steady, still trusting. That trust felt heavier than the rain soaking through my clothes. It felt like a promise I didn't know how to keep. When the distant sound of a vehicle finally cut through the night, faint but growing, my legs nearly gave out with relief. I held the puppies closer, shielding them from the wind, and stayed right there in the mud beside her, afraid that if I moved even an inch, the fragile balance keeping her alive would break. The headlights appeared between the trees, harsh and unreal, and for the first time since I'd opened my door that night, I allowed myself to believe We might not be too late. But as the rescuers rushed toward us, their voices urgent, their movements fast, I noticed something that sent a fresh chill through me. The dog's breathing had slowed, not steadied, slowed. And in that moment, even with help finally arriving, I realized the night still hadn't decided how this would end. The ride to the emergency clinic felt longer than it should have, even though the lights were flashing and the road ahead was clear. I sat in the back of the rescue van, bracing myself against the metal wall as it rattled over uneven pavement, the smell of wet fur and antiseptic mixing in the air. The dog lay stretched out on a blanket beside me, her breathing shallow, her body finally still, now that the pain had burned through whatever strength she had left. One of the volunteers kept working quietly near her head, checking her pulse, whispering reassurances that sounded more like prayers than instructions. I held the puppies close to my chest, feeling their tiny movements, counting every breath like it was something that could be taken away if I stopped paying attention. At the clinic, everything moved fast and slow at the same time. Doors opened, voices overlapped, hands reached in from every direction. Someone gently took the puppies from me, wrapping them in warm towels, while another team lifted the dog onto a table and disappeared behind swinging doors. I stood there soaked and shaking, my jacket heavy with rain and mud, suddenly very aware of how small I felt without her eyes watching me anymore. For the first time that night, there was nothing left for me to do but wait, and waiting, I've learned, is often the hardest part of caring. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time loses its shape in places like that. When the veterinarian finally came out, her face was tired but calm. She told me the dog would survive, the puppies too, though it would be a close road for all of them. Relief washed through me so suddenly my knees nearly buckled. I thanked her more times than necessary, my voice thick with something I didn't try to hide. As she turned to leave, she paused and asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you know where she came from?" "Came." I shook my head. I told her she'd shown up at my door. That was all I knew. The vet nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something she already suspected. She gestured toward the waiting area, where a couple of people stood quietly, talking in low voices. One of them was a woman from the next town over. I recognized her immediately. Everyone around here knows everyone, even if they pretend they don't. She looked at me for a moment, then looked away, her jaw tightening like she was biting back words she didn't want to say out loud. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The dog wasn't a stray, not really. She belonged to a family a few miles away. A nice house, clean yard, good reputation. When the dog became pregnant, she stopped being a pet and started being a problem. The family didn't want neighbors talking, didn't want questions, didn't want responsibility. So they did what people do when something no longer fits into the story they tell about themselves. They pushed it out of sight. They drove her away late one night and left her near the old drainage area, assuming nature would take care of the rest. I felt something twist inside me as the words settled. I thought about the way she had knocked on my door, the way she hadn't begged, the way she'd walked carefully, saving just enough strength to get back to me. She had been abandoned at the moment she needed help most, not because she was dangerous or broken, but because she was inconvenient. I'd lived long enough to recognize that kind of cruelty. It wears clean clothes and smiles politely. It doesn't look like a villain. It looks like someone protecting their image. I didn't say anything to the woman. I didn't need to. Her silence said enough. As she turned and walked out, I watched her shoulders straighten, as if shedding a weight she'd decided no longer belonged to her. I wondered how easily people learn to do that, how easily they leave living things behind and convince themselves it was necessary. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world looked calm again, like nothing terrible had happened at all. When I finally saw the dog again, she was resting under a heat lamp, eyes half open, breathing slow but steady. One of the puppies lay tucked against her belly, instinctively finding warmth. I reached out and rested my hand near her paw, not touching, just close enough for her to feel I was there. Her eyes shifted toward me, and for a brief moment something passed between us that felt heavier than gratitude. It felt like recognition, like she knew I hadn't turned away. Standing there, watching a life recover from something it never should have had to survive, I realized this story wasn't about a dog anymore. It was about choices, about who we abandon when it becomes inconvenient, and about how sometimes the ones we call animals are the only ones who remember what loyalty actually looks like. I didn't go home that night the way I had left it. When I finally stepped back through my front door, the house felt different, not louder, not warmer, just less empty. The clock on the wall still ticked the same way it always had, and the chair by the window still waited where I'd left it, but something invisible had shifted. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like rest. It felt unfinished. I sat down slowly, my body sore in places I'd forgotten could ache, and realized I'd been holding my breath through most of my life without knowing it. The clinic called the next morning, then again the day after. Each time the updates were careful but hopeful. The dog was recovering well. The puppies were feeding. Small victories, measured in ounces and minutes, but victories all the same. On the third day, the veterinarian asked me a question that lingered longer than it should have. She asked if I planned to come see them again. I told her yes before I had time to think about what that meant. I think she heard the truth in my voice because she didn't ask anything else. When I walked back into the clinic, the dog lifted her head the moment she heard my footsteps. She didn't struggle to stand. She didn't whine. She simply watched me approach, eyes clear now, body resting in a way that told me she felt safe enough to let go. One of the puppies crawled awkwardly toward her, bumping into her leg, and she nudged it back gently with her nose. I felt something tighten in my chest as I watched them together. It wasn't joy, it wasn't sadness. It was recognition, the kind you feel when you see a future forming quietly, without asking for permission. The veterinarian spoke carefully, like she didn't want to scare the moment away. She told me the family that had abandoned the dog had made it clear they didn't want her back. There would be paperwork, she said, forms, decisions. I nodded, pretending those things mattered more than they did. I had already made my decision long before she finished speaking. Some things don't arrive in your life as questions, they arrive as answers. I brought them home a week later. The dog stepped into my house like she'd always known where the walls would be. She sniffed the corners slowly, deliberately, then settled near the same spot where she'd first knocked on the door. The puppies followed in a clumsy line, unaware of how close they had come to never knowing warmth at all. I watched them from my chair, afraid to interrupt something sacred. For years I had lived inside routines built to avoid pain. Meals at the same hour, lights off at the same time, no attachments I couldn't lose. And here they were, dismantling all of it without effort. Caring for them gave shape to my days again. Morning walks became something to look forward to, evenings filled with small sounds, paws on the floor, soft breaths rising and falling, the gentle chaos of life insisting on being noticed. The dog stayed close, always aware of where I was, always watching in a way that didn't feel like guarding, but choosing. I talked to her more than I'd talked to anyone in years. Not because she needed the words, but because saying them out loud reminded me I was still here. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch, watching her lie in the sun with her puppies curled against her, I understood something that surprised me. She hadn't just come to my door for help. She had come because she sensed something in me I hadn't acknowledged myself, a space that had been waiting to be filled. People talk about animals being rescued, but they don't often talk about the way rescue moves in both directions, quietly, without ceremony, without witnesses. That night, as I locked the door and turned off the light, I paused with my hand on the switch. The dog was already settled near the doorway, eyes half closed, breathing steady. I realized then that the knock I'd heard days earlier wasn't the beginning of her story. It was the end of mine, the lonely one at least. And as I stood there in the dim room, listening to the sound of life sleeping under my roof, I knew something with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer alone. Word travels slowly in small towns, but it never travels quietly. I didn't tell anyone what had happened that night, not because I was hiding it, but because it didn't feel like my story to announce. Still, people noticed. They noticed the dog walking beside me in the mornings, her pace steady, her head high. They noticed the puppies growing stronger by the week, tumbling across my yard like they'd always belonged there. And eventually someone asked the question I knew was coming. "Where did you get her?" I answered simply. I said, "She knocked on my door." Most people laughed at that, the way they do when they don't know how to respond to something that doesn't fit neatly into their understanding of the world. But the laughter never lasted. There was something about the way I said it that made them pause, like they sensed there was more beneath the words. In places like this, truth has a way of seeping out through silence. It doesn't need explaining. It waits. The family who had abandoned her stopped coming to the feed store. When they did show up, they kept their eyes down, conversations shorter than usual. No one confronted them directly. That isn't how things work here. Judgment doesn't arrive in shouting or accusation. It arrives in absence, in the way people stop asking about your life, in the way chairs remain empty when you sit down. They never came to see the dog. They never asked about the puppies. That told me everything I needed to know. One afternoon, a neighbor I'd known for years stopped by unannounced. He stood at the edge of my yard for a moment, watching the dog lie in the shade while the puppies played nearby. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded slowly, like he was witnessing something he hadn't expected to understand. Then he said almost to himself, "She chose right." It wasn't a compliment, it was a verdict. He left a few minutes later, and I never forgot the look on his face as he walked away. The dog adapted to town life in her own quiet way. She didn't bark at passing cars. She didn't chase noise. She watched. She observed. When people approached, she waited for my reaction before deciding her own. Children, especially, seemed drawn to her. They sat on the grass beside her, careful and gentle, as if they understood she carried a history heavier than her body. Watching that taught me something I wish I'd learned earlier in life, that kindness doesn't need explanation. It recognizes itself. Sometimes late in the afternoon, I would catch people slowing their cars as they passed my house, not stopping, just looking. I wondered what they saw, an old man and a dog, or a reminder. Stories have a way of becoming mirrors. They show us who we are, not who we pretend to be. I never corrected anyone's assumptions. I didn't need to. The truth was already doing its work. The dog stayed close to me at night, resting near the door, as if honoring the place where everything had begun. I'd watch her breathe in the quiet hours, the house finally full in a way it had never been before. I thought about the choice she'd made, to knock instead of lie down somewhere and wait for the end. That decision had changed more than her fate. It had altered the rhythm of an entire town, if only slightly. And sometimes, slight changes are the ones that last. I didn't feel pride about any of it. Pride belongs to stories where someone wins. This wasn't that kind of story. This was about presence, about staying, about opening a door when it would have been easier not to. As the sun set one evening and the yard filled with long shadows, I realized that what people whispered about wasn't the drama of abandonment or rescue. It was the quiet fact that something decent had happened, and that scared people more than cruelty ever could. Because decency asks something back. Some nights, when the house is quiet and the world seems to slow down enough to hear itself breathe, I sit in my chair by the door and think about that first knock. Not the sound of it, but the moment before it. The life I was living when I believed assumed silence meant peace. I had arranged my days carefully back then, trimming away anything that might ask too much of me. Grief, attachment, responsibility. I told myself it was wisdom that came with age. Now I know it was fear wearing the shape of routine. The dog sleeps near the door most nights, not guarding it, just resting there, as if remembering. Her breathing is steady, calm, nothing like the ragged rhythm I first heard in the dark. The puppies have grown enough to explore beyond the yard now, but they always return before nightfall, circling back like they understand where safety lives. I watch them and realize how close I came to missing all of this, not because I was cruel, but because I was tired. And sometimes that's all it takes to let something good slip past you. I've been asked why I opened the door that night. People expect a reason that sounds noble: courage, kindness, duty. The truth is simpler and harder to admit. I opened it because I recognized her. Not as a dog, but as something familiar. A living being pushed aside when life became inconvenient. I had spent years feeling like that myself. Quietly set apart, useful only in memory. When she knocked, she wasn't asking me to save her. She was asking me not to turn away. There's a difference. Since that night, I've left the door unlocked more often than I used to. Not because I expect another miracle, but because I've learned something about thresholds. Doors aren't meant to protect us from the world forever. Sometimes they exist so we can choose when to let life back in. That knock reminded me that compassion rarely arrives at a convenient hour, and it almost never announces itself with certainty. It waits, hoping we'll listen. I don't know what would have happened to her if she'd chosen another house. I don't like thinking about that. What I do know is this: she trusted me with everything she had left, and in return, she gave me something I didn't know I was still capable of receiving: purpose, company, a reason to wake up and step outside even when my bones protest and the mornings feel heavy. That night, I thought I was opening my door for a pregnant dog. I was wrong. I was opening it for myself. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like life passed you by quietly, or that asking for help was something you waited too long to do, remember this: sometimes all it takes to change everything is answering a knock you almost ignore.